Lieutenant Decrag yanked a terrified diplomat behind a metal crate as a blue plasma bolt crackled through the air centimeters from his head. Of all the missions he had been on over his career, this was only the second craziest. Nothing quite matched up to riding in the wreckage of an intentionally destroyed freighter to hide drop pods. Though, Decrag thought, hijacking a Golsak Pact VIP shuttle to infiltrate a prison mining outpost was coming close. "I said get moving!" Decrag shouted at the diplomat, trying to overcome the alarms blaring in the concrete hall. He, along with 24 others, were arrested when the Golsak Pact declared war on the Confederacy. What the Confederacy didn't know was the now defunct Jikor People's Republic was a vassal state of the Golsak. The Pact had been using the Jikor as a secret smuggling route to obtain Confederate technology. To say the Pact was furious when the Confederacy conquered the Jikor worlds and are showing excellent progress converting them into an actual democratic society would be an understatement. The mission was classified as near suicide. Because of the long simmering cold conflict between the Pact and the Confederacy, few, if any, of the member races were present in each other's territory. The moment Decrag's team exited the shuttle, it would be obvious they weren't from around here. The moment they left the VIP shuttle on the private rooftop pad of the prison, the team was in constant enemy contact. The only advantage Decrag had was the prison guards were not equipped, trained, or prepared to engage with a Confederacy Special Operations Command, CSOC Special Forces raid. The team was equipped with the latest in Confederate anti-plasma armor and top-of-the-line weaponry. It didn't mean it would be a simple task against a force of prison guards armed with force throwers and only a small armory designed to quell riots. 5 highly trained CSOC soldiers would still have a difficult and dangerous battle going against thousands of enemies. The raid initially went well. The guards were surprised and poorly organized. The team was able to navigate the prison barracks and extract the dignitaries. They were segregated from the general population and kept in conditions barely considered livable. They were held for ransom, not as guests. Getting out again was proving to be the bigger challenge. The VIP shuttle was not only too small for extraction, it would either be disabled or heavily guarded. The only briefing Decrag had was his extraction would be on the freight landing pads and would be marked with the human number 3. The whole operation smelled like a Confederacy intelligence service op. He hated it when CIS got involved, since they always kept crucial information close to the vest. "They're coming from the other direction," Specialist Saponis shouted. He was a member of the Felid Veru race. His grey and white striped ears were exposed when he lost his helmet to a stray plasma bolt. Decrag was happy with the team's newest member. Saponis was a fresh graduate of the training program, and this was his first mission. There weren't any easy missions to get a new CSOC soldier prepared for the realities of the command. New recruits were walking patrols in predictable engagements one day, and thrown into crazy nonsense like this the next. The only way you know if you had what it takes was if you got home alive. "We can only hope Sergeant Vasily and the others were successful," Decrag shouted back, as he blind fired his plasma rifle around the corner. A scream from behind the metal crate was the only indication his attack hit a guard. Of all the various critical moments in the rescue operation, this was one of them. Decrag and Saponis were flanking 25 frightened diplomats in front of a large metal doorway. The doors were currently locked shut, and the only cover the group had was a pile of metal shipping containers recently delivered to the warehouse. Beyond the door was the freight pad, where the expected extract was waiting. "Is it normal to take this long?" Saponis yelled back over the diplomats, as he took shots around his corner of the containers. Decrag shrugged. "No idea, just trust in your team. That's all we can do in this business." Decrag wished Lieutenant Gore was still around and in command. The unflappable human. Had he not sacrificed himself to complete the mission to crack open Jikor's planetary defense encirclement, would know what to do here. Decrag felt like he was stumbling around in the dark when he got promoted to the officer ranks. He had a newfound respect for the officers he previously ridiculed as a sergeant. Their job was not easy. Decrag became worried as time passed. More bolts sizzled by and impacted the thick metal doors with a splash. He had to throw back a pair of grenades tossed his direction. It would only be a matter of time before he and Saponis were overwhelmed. After a few more shots passed by DeCrag, the squealing of metal pierced the air as the massive gears of the warehouse door began to move. The door started to crack open. DeCrag prayed it was Fusili and the others. If it was another guard patrol, then this would be the end of the line. "Come on!" a feminine voice shouted over the scraping metal. DeCrag allowed his head crest to flutter with happiness at the sound. Sergeant Vasily had come through and managed to get the door open. While Fusili ushered the diplomats through the door, DeCrag and Saponis began their firing withdrawal. "Get that door closed!" DeCrag ordered after everyone exited the warehouse. "Can't!" Specialist Rahili replied. He was training his plasma rifle to one side, and only allowed a nod in the direction of what he was speaking about. DeCrag's eyes followed the direction his purple beak gestured toward, and saw the control panel blasted out. "A stray shot hit it, and I had to mess with the wiring to open the bay," Rahili explained as he fired his plasma rifle at a guard's head, peeking out from behind a shuttle. "Please tell me the other mission is a success," DeCrag said. "We got it done," Specialist Tahili replied. She held a small tube with a button on the end in her live blue hand and pressed it. Heavy thuds impacted the air in the distance as a series of blue explosions lit up the base of a tall tower. The tower, the flight communication center, toppled over and crashed into a row of waiting freight ships. "I really hope our ride wasn't over there," DeCrag grumbled, as he snapped off another shot past the still screaming warehouse door. "Already checked, LT," Fusili replied back. "Best we can figure is it's on the other side of the tarmac." "Come on then," DeCrag said, as he backed away from the warehouse. DeCrag knew Fus Radar, a name the late LT Gore gave the trio, would be diligent in their duties. "We need to find our ride and get off this rock." DeCrag wasn't looking forward to finding the marking indicating their extract ship. The tarmac had dozens of rows of large ore freighters, each looking identical. It could take precious minutes or even upwards of an hour to find the marking. "Found it!" Saponis pointed to a ship nestled in a line with a few others. DeCrag was surprised Saponis identified the ship so quickly. That is, until he spied the marking. Inside of a subtle, small number on a landing gear, the ship had a towering human number 3 painted onto the dark grey hull. The number was slanted to the left and was painted on in a brilliant white paint. A thin, bright orange border ringed the number, adding to the visible contrast on the hull paint. The team made their way across the open tarmac, providing covering fire to ensure the prison guards were suppressed behind their cover. As they did, the freighter pilot opened the front-facing bay under the cockpit. A few stray incoming plasma bolts impacted on the shield the pilot had activated to cover the retreat. DeCrag briefly noticed the shield look unusually weak, even for a bulk freighter. DeCrag was the last up the opening ramp as he kept his weapon firing. While the ship's shields would keep them safe, it wouldn't stop the guards from storming inside the protective bubble and overwhelming the now trapped escapees. Only when the ramp started to close did DeCrag pull back and allow himself to review the interior. The freighter had a cavernous interior. Bolted to the floor along the vessel's center line were dozens of seats with straps. The walls had exposed wiring and pipes where the normal steel coverings had been removed. DeCrag couldn't comprehend what the unusual array of wires and piping was for. The vessel had clearly been heavily modified. "Lieutenant DeCrag," a voice with a drawl that reminded DeCrag of Lieutenant Gore, sounded over the ship's speakers. "I'll need your team to ensure everyone is strapped down, and I'll need you up here in the cockpit." DeCrag, impressed the human aboard properly pronounced his full name, nodded to his perplexed team. "You heard the man," DeCrag barked. Despite his order, he was equally confused by the statement. DeCrag left his team to secure the frightened diplomats, and took a small elevator up to the cockpit deck and entered the room. Seated in the pilot's seat was a human. He turned his seat and DeCrag examined the man. He had cut brown hair on top of a face with sharp, angular features. He had intense blue eyes that contrasted with the unusually friendly shape the wrinkles took around the edges of his skin. A thick bush of hair called a moustache graced his upper lip. The human had well-defined muscles and a surprisingly thick neck. He was someone Crag wouldn't want to get into a fistfight with. Not only was he already a Death Order species, he had an impressive physique even for their species. The man's attire was unusual. He wore a brown leather jacket with sewn-on patches up and down the arms. Crag recognized a few patches as human ship component manufacturers. He wasn't sure what the point of the uniform was. It was clearly another one of the odd CIS agent behaviors. The human gestured to the co-pilot seat. "I need a hand. Strap in and let's blow this popsicle stand." Crag did as instructed and snapped his harness tight over his chest. "What's with the belts?" "Ain't got an inertial dampener in this bucket," the human replied as he flipped a number of switches. "Mind getting the engines powered?" Crag looked at his control panel. While it was heavily modified, he did find the engine start switch. He flipped it up and an indicator came to life. The power readings Crag saw on the panel were astronomical. His eyes went wide and he reached to depower the engines. "Hey, leave that be," the human said calmly, as energy bolts thudded against the shield. "It's well beyond their limit," Crag shouted. "They'll blow if we try to take off." A small grin showed up on the human's face. "They'll be fine. I modified the engines myself. Mind turning dial number 1 all the way up?" Crag found the dial and turned it as far as it would go. "I don't understand. Why isn't there an inertial dampener?" "I had to work within the limits of a standard Pact freighter power core," the human explained in a sedate drawl as he flipped more switches. "I needed to cut out weight and power draw to keep the engines purring. Inertial dampeners eat a lot of power." Now Crag understood why they had to be strapped in. Whenever the ship made any maneuvers, the occupants would be thrown around. "I surmise that's why the shield is acting weak, even for a freighter." "Got it in one," the human smiled. "I had to draw extra power. The shields will withstand the infantry stuff. If they get something bigger, or God forbid an interceptor, we'd be toast." As the human prepped for launch, the prison guards started to swarm the ship from across the tarmac. Crag spied one carrying a cutting torch. "We better get moving. Which dial is the anti-grav engine?" "Had to pull that one too," the human said. Crag's eyes went wide. "How do you intend to get us off the planet?" Instead of replying, the human only gave another smile. He flipped a switch to the ship's intercom and spoke. "Everyone, we're gonna take off in a few seconds. I suggest you pucker your butts and hold on tight. It's gonna be a rough ride." The human then turned to Crag. "I suggest you keep your back and head firmly against the seat." Crag was about to ask why when the human jammed his finger onto a button. Far below, Crag could hear hatches opening and something moving out of the hull. Then, outside the cockpit window, blue fire erupted from under the ship. The guards swarming the vessel were cooked in the flames. From outside the freighter hull, explosions rang out. Crag didn't have time to observe the screaming guards on the periphery of the inferno before the ship lurched suddenly upward. Just as the ship cleared the level of the nearby prison building, the human rammed the throttle forward, and Crag was shoved backwards into his seat. The force Crag experienced was far worse than anything he had ever experienced in training or on actual missions. He gritted his teeth as his arms were held immobile into the cushioned chair. A dial on the modified display was rapidly counting up in human numbers. He could barely recall under the strain the numbers. It ticked up to 6.8, and next to it was the human letter G. The blue sky of the planet's atmosphere rapidly vanished into the blackness of space. Crag continued to grit his teeth as he barely twisted his eyes to look at the human pilot. Even the Death Order was showing strain under the force of acceleration. After a few minutes of intense agony, the human reached out and, demonstrating his strength, carefully pulled the throttle back. Crag watched the indicator tick back down to 0.7, which was still a difficult pull but now manageable. "What in the void was that?" Crag shouted at the human. "That was what 4 Class F racing engines at 80% power can do," the human replied. His eyes were wide and he had a giant smile on his face. Crag was flabbergasted. This insane human was enjoying the thrust. Isn't that excessive? DeCrack growled as he rubbed a shoulder muscle. Not if we wanted to get out of atmosphere before their anti-air activated, or their in-atmosphere craft scrambled, the human replied. Still, that's way too much, DeCrack snapped back. The human didn't respond and instead activated his spherical hologram sensor. He pointed at a number of pings. DeCrack recognized them. They were warp signatures. Not if we want to avoid those, the human said, pointing at the image. DeCrack cursed. A small fleet arrived around the planet escorting a large carrier. The Pact wasn't playing around. The carrier began disgorging fighter craft, encircling the escape route. To the ship's port, a large asteroid was being crunched up, and its matter streamed down to the mining outpost. DeCrack marveled at the technology on display, clearly stolen from the Confederacy. He didn't know the Pact knew how to capture and process asteroids. DeCrack began to worry when he saw the movement. I think we're gonna die here. The human continued to be calm and unflappable. We got about 20 minutes before they're on us. I'll have something by then. How? We're still under the warp inhibitor, DeCrack replied. Don't you worry none, the human replied. Just take your mind off things while I plan something. DeCrack turned and looked at the human. He was studying the sensor sphere with an easy look on his face. Who are you? The human responded. Oh, I'm just your run-of-the-mill smuggler. DeCrack blinked. A smuggler? In Pact space? The human hummed in affirmation. I have contacts to move Confederacy tech into Pact space. Anger flared into DeCrack's head. He pulled his sidearm and pointed it at the human. You been selling Confederate tech to our enemies? I should kill you where you sit. Don't go jumping to conclusions, the human said, not looking over at DeCrack. Since my cover's blown anyway, this was all part of a CIS op. Ever wonder why the stuff the Pact tries to copy from us never works properly? DeCrack kept his force pistol pointed at the human. Explain. A smile crept on the human's face. It's because I've been smuggling in defective parts. It's not obvious. Logic errors here, small mistakes there, key components missing, etc. The Pact isn't too bright. They spend a lot of time and effort copying our tech, since they don't have the institutions or know-how to develop their own. They have no idea if it's busted or not. Even better, they're known for being corrupt and cutting corners, so they end up assuming it's internal incompetence that causes it to fail. DeCrack lowered his pistol and belted out a laugh. You've been poisoning their R&D. Brilliant! I think we need introductions. What should I call you? Another smirk came from the human. You know CIS rules. Can't give you a name. I'm going to disappear again somewhere else after I drop you boys off. I can't call you human, DeCrack protested. It's rude. The human thought for a moment. Just call me Earnhardt. It was another strange human name. Good to meet you, Earnhardt. Earnhardt only gave a small smile back. The time passed quickly. 5 minutes out from contact, Earnhardt suddenly veered the vessel toward the asteroid. What are you doing? DeCrack asked. Getting us a leg up, Earnhardt replied, as he pushed the engines to 1G. Even with my modified engines, this is a big beast of a ship. Their fighters will have inertial dampeners and will outrun us in open space. DeCrack gritted his teeth under the force. I don't understand. Well, I think it's about time to introduce you to some good old-fashioned North Carolina rum running, Earnhardt said, with a hint of excitement on his voice. The dial ticked up to 1.5G as Earnhardt accelerated further. DeCrack struggled under the pull. He felt his nerves rise when he realized Earnhardt was still aiming at the crushing facility. What are you doing? Gonna go through, Earnhardt replied. Are you crazy? DeCrack shouted. The gaps in the material are barely big enough to fit our ship, and there are thousands of kilometers of materials to pass through. Earnhardt hummed in agreement, the force not impacting him yet. That's right. They can follow us through or go around. Either way, we'll use their own mining facility to escape. DeCrack's response was interrupted when Earnhardt juked the ship to the side. His eyes were intently following the spherical sensor, which he pulled in close to the ship. He moved the vessel out of the way of a streaking projectile one of the interceptors had fired. DeCrag watched the bolt of energy suddenly fly past the cockpit in the void, before the time charge detonated it impotently a few kilometers away.
"Why are you flying so slow?"
DeCrag squeaked out. "Gotta draw them in and make them think they can catch up," Earnhardt replied. Earnhardt subtly adjusted the acceleration down as he pivoted towards the stream of minerals flowing down from the station to the planet below. The ship lurched again as the pilot deftly dodged out of the way of incoming fire. The freighter's modifications were clearly more than simple speed. The human had installed overcharged maneuvering thrusters as well. As the ship came close to the matter stream, Earnhardt punched the thrusters again. Already moving at tremendous speeds, the vessel pumped forward. The dial ramped up to 6.8 again, and plunged into the rock stream. On the sensor, a number of fighters broke off and tried to pull away. About half the pursuers elected to try and fly around the stream. Others followed in, a few signals winking out when they impacted a moving rock. Earnhardt continued to prove human insanity when he maintained his 6.8G acceleration into the material field. They were already moving fast, and he continued to push the freighter to move faster. The man's reflexes were astounding. From his position, DeCrag was pressed motionless under the strain, while Earnhardt's blue eyes stared intensely at the sensors and flicked out through the cockpit window. He expertly maneuvered the freighter into spins to align the hull to the next opening, moved the ship sideways to match rock movements, and rapidly cut in every direction. He expertly threaded the vessel through the tight and dangerous space. All the while, more pursuing sensor signals winked out of existence. The enemy fighters, despite being smaller and more maneuverable, lacked the piloting expertise to successfully pull off the stunt. The spinning outside the cockpit window was beginning to make DeCrag feel nauseous. Up and down, already a challenge in space, were thrown in every direction. A particular close call had a chunk of iron move within meters of the cockpit window, as Earnhardt spun the ship through an unusual curved path. Then, the ship was finally out of the field. No pursuers exited the death zone, while the ones attempting to move around were now far in the rear. A few more minutes of acceleration had the freighter beyond the warp inhibitor field, and they jumped out to FTL. The thrusters cut upon the jump, and the ship went into zero gravity. Once in FTL, Earnhardt signaled to DeCrag. "Turn dial 2 until the indicator reads 0.33G. DeCrag did as instructed, and he felt the comfortable weight descend upon him. "How did you learn to do that?" Earnhardt snorted. "Look up human autosports." It was another cryptic response from the human, who went silent for the remainder of the trip. After pulling into a military station, DeCrag assisted his team with escorting the diplomats off the freighter. While they were thankful for their rescue, the diplomats shared DeCrag's desire to get away from the insane human, and his absurd high-gravity piloting. Finally, on the station deck and out of the ship, DeCrag turned to see Earnhardt in the bay. "Hey, Earnhardt? Want to join us for a celebratory drink?" Earnhardt shrugged. "Sorry, DeCrag. Duty calls." Earnhardt gave a small wave before his visage was obscured by the closing bay door. Shortly after, the crazy freighter with the big white and orange number 3 painted on the side pulled away and vanished into FTL. During the debrief, DeCrag tried to recommend a commendation for Earnhardt for the insane stunt he pulled. The general only responded by insisting he never heard of such a man. Yet another strange CIS game those spies like to play. Returning to his quarters, DeCrag decided to pull up his network access and search for human automotive racing. He had an array of different types to draw from: NASCAR, Le Mans, F1, Indy, and more. The one he ended up randomly selecting was off-road rally racing. DeCrag watched enthralled as wheeled vehicles whined loudly across dirt tracks, barely wider than the car itself. The drivers precariously slid over loose gravel around tight turns, mere meters away from human attendants. The vehicles launched into the air and thudded hard under Earth's crushing gravity as they cleared hills. Other times, he saw the results of errors, as the vehicles rolled and crushed into trees or down embankments. All the while, DeCrag could only think of one thing. He was happy the humans were on the side of the Confederacy.